Ambassador Catherine stood at the viewing window of the Volanti diplomatic station and watched the conquered world spin slowly below him. Its blue oceans and green lands now belonged to the Empire, and its people would learn to serve as so many others had before them. This was the way of things, the natural order that his species had maintained for 50,000 years. His forearms were folded behind his back in the formal posture of contemplation, and his golden scales caught the starlight as he turned to face his senior advisor, who had just entered the chamber with news that would change everything. "Ambassador, your gift has arrived from the High Council," the advisor announced with a bow. "A companion species specimen human, female, in excellent condition and fully trained for diplomatic service." Catherine made a sound of mild interest, though in truth he had never wanted a companion. The practice had always seemed excessive to him, a display of wealth and status that served no real purpose beyond vanity. But refusing a gift from the High Council would be a grave insult. So he nodded and gestured for the advisor to bring her in. The doors opened, and 2 guards entered first, followed by a small figure that walked with quiet dignity despite the ornate collar around her neck. She was human, one of the newest species to fall under Volanti influence, and Catherine had to admit that he found their appearance strange. Only 2 arms, soft skin without scales, and those curious round eyes that seemed to hold depths he could not reach. Stopped at the proper distance and knelt, as she had been trained, her head bowed and her hands flat on the floor in the position of absolute submission. The collar around her neck glowed faintly with the blue light of active translation circuits and tracking systems, a leash that could not be removed, a constant reminder of her status. "You may rise," Catherine said, and he watched as she stood with a grace that surprised him. "What designation were you given?" "This one is called Companion 749 Ambassador," she replied in a voice that was steady and calm. "This one has been trained in diplomatic protocols, translation services, and personal attendance. This one exists to serve your needs and bring honor to your house." The formal speech patterns grated on Catherine in a way he did not expect. There was something in her eyes that did not match her words, a sharpness that her training had not quite managed to dim, but he dismissed the thought and waved his hand in acknowledgement. "You will attend to the refreshment table during tomorrow's trade negotiation with the Korath delegation," he instructed. "Stay silent unless spoken to, and do not interfere with the proceedings under any circumstances. This one understands and obeys." "Ambassador." She was led away to the servant quarters, and Catherine returned to his window to watch the stars. He did not think about her again until the next day, when everything changed. The negotiation chamber was filled with tension as the Korath delegation presented their demands. They were an aggressive species, all sharp teeth and armored hides, and they wanted exclusive mining rights to 3 systems that the Volanti had already promised to another client species. The situation was delicate, and Catherine, as advisors, had prepared a counteroffer that would balance both parties' interests, but something was wrong. Catherine could see it in the way the Korath leader's eyes narrowed as his senior advisor presented the terms. The numbers were incorrect, the calculations flawed in a way that would cost the Empire billions of credits over the contract's lifetime, and worse, the Korath had noticed, which meant they thought the Volanti were trying to cheat them. War could start over such insults. The human companion moved silently around the table, refilling drinks and collecting empty plates. No one paid attention to her, which was the point of companion species. They were invisible, part of the furniture. Beneath notice, she paused beside Catherine and leaned close as if to refill his glass. Her whisper was so quiet that only he could hear it. "The resource calculation in Section 4 uses the wrong unit conversion. Korath standard units are larger than ours by a factor of 12, and your advisor has it reversed. If you correct it now and blame a translation error, you can save face for everyone and triple the actual profit margin." Then she was gone. Moving to the other side of the table, as if nothing had happened. Rand's mind raced as he reviewed the numbers in his head. She was right, the error was obvious once he knew to look for it. And his advisors had missed it completely because they had not bothered to truly understand Korath measurement systems. He raised his hand to pause the proceedings and made the correction himself, blaming the translation software for the confusion. The Korath leaders' hostility melted into grudging respect, and by the end of the session, they'd agreed to terms far more favorable than anyone had expected. When the delegation left, Ketharan dismissed his advisors and turned to face the human who stood quietly in the corner, waiting to be released to her duties. "Come here," he commanded, and she approached with her head bowed. "Look at me." She raised her eyes, and he saw it again, that sharpness, that hidden depth that spoke of intelligence far beyond what her training should allow. "How did you know about Korath unit systems?" he demanded. This one studied them. "Ambassador, why would a companion study such things?" For a moment, something flickered in her expression, a crack in the mask that revealed the person beneath. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, losing some of its trained formality. "Because I was not always a companion, Ambassador. Before your people came to Earth, I was a diplomatic attaché for the United Nations, specializing in first contact protocols and alien cultural studies. I volunteered for this program because someone had to watch and learn and remember." Ketharan should have reported her immediately. Harboring a spy was treason, and her confession was grounds for execution. But instead, he found himself asking a question that no Volanthi had ever asked a companion species. "What is your name, your real name?" She hesitated, searching his face for the trap. When she found none, she answered, "Elena." "My name is Elena Vasquez." He nodded slowly, feeling the weight of a decision he did not fully understand settle onto his shoulders. This small human had just saved his career and possibly prevented a war. And she had done it from a position of absolute powerlessness. There was something in that which deserved respect. Something that made him question everything he had been taught about companion species and their proper place in the galaxy. "Elena," he repeated, testing the strange sounds. "I believe we have much to discuss." 3 months had passed since the day Elena Vasquez revealed her true self to Ambassador Ketharan. And in that time, the world inside his private chambers had become something entirely different from the world outside. Here, behind locked doors and deactivated surveillance systems, the collar around her neck lay dormant on a shelf, unused, unwanted. A symbol of a relationship that no longer existed between them. She sat across from him, now at his personal study table, a cup of human tea steaming beside her hand, as she explained the concept of democracy to a being whose species had known only hierarchy for 50,000 years. Her voice was animated, her hands moving as she spoke, and Ketharan found himself leaning forward with genuine fascination. "So the leaders are chosen by the common people," he repeated slowly, his translator struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in Volanthi language. "And if the people become unhappy with their leaders, they can simply remove them through this voting process?" "Exactly," Elena said with a smile that lit up her whole face. "It is not a perfect system. We spent centuries fighting over who should be allowed to vote. And some of our democracies have failed spectacularly. But the core idea is that power should flow from the consent of the governed, not from the strength of those who govern." Ketharan sat back and processed this. In Volanthi society, power came from caste and bloodline, from ancient traditions that stretched back to the dawn of their civilization. The idea that a common worker might have a voice equal to a High Lord was not just strange. It was almost impossible to imagine. "Your species is very young," he observed. "How long have humans existed?" Our recorded history spans about 5,000 years. But our species has walked the Earth for perhaps 300,000. And in that time, you developed space travel, nuclear power, digital networks. And democracy? Catharan said. We have existed for 50 times as long, and yet, he paused, struggling with a thought that felt like betrayal. And yet, what has changed? Elena finished gently. I wondered the same thing when I first studied Volanthi history. Your art from 10,000 years ago looks almost identical to your art today. Your social structures, your religious practices, your governmental systems, they have remained static while the universe changed around you. We call it stability, Catharan replied, but his voice lacked conviction. We call it the perfection of our ways, and humans call it stagnation, Elena said without cruelty. We are the opposite. We change so fast that sometimes we break ourselves in the process. We have nearly destroyed our own planet 3 times. And we have fought wars so terrible that millions died in single battles. But we also cured diseases that killed half our population. We walked on our moon before we had computers in our homes. And we never, ever stopped reaching for something better. She pulled a small device from her pocket and activated a holographic display. Music filled the air, strange and beautiful sounds that made Catharan's scales tingle with an emotion he could not name. This is called Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, Elena explained. It was composed by a human who had gone completely deaf. He could not hear a single note of his own creation. And yet he wrote something that has moved people to tears for 200 years. That is what humans are. Ambassador, we are creatures who compose symphonies in silence and build rockets in poverty and dream of stars while standing in mud. Catharan listened to the music and felt something shift inside him. For the first time in his long life, he understood that he had been sleeping, that his entire species had been sleeping, and this small human was showing him what it meant to be awake over the following weeks. Elena shared more of her people's treasures. She showed him paintings and poetry, scientific discoveries, and philosophical debates. She told him stories of human heroes who gave their lives for strangers, and human villains who destroyed everything they touched. We contain multitudes, she said one evening as they watched a human film about a war that had killed millions. We are capable of the greatest good and the greatest evil. Often at the same time, we are not better than other species, Ambassador. But we are different in ways that matter. You are hungry, Catharan said, remembering her words from their first real conversation. Your species hungers for more than any other I have encountered. Yes, Elena agreed. And that hunger can be terrible. It has led us to conquer and enslave and destroy. But it also leads us to explore, to create, to love with an intensity that burns like a star. We are not content with what is, because we can always imagine what could be. Their conversations were not one-sided. Catharan shared his own doubts with Elena. Secrets he had never spoken aloud to anyone. He told her of the reformist faction within the empire. Nobles who whispered in private that perhaps the old ways were not perfect after all. He told her of his growing disgust with the companion system, with the casual cruelty of treating sentient beings as fashion accessories and status symbols. Elena became more than his secret. She became his advisor, his strategist, his friend. She helped him navigate political conflicts with insights that his own people would never have offered. She saw patterns that Volanthi minds missed, connections that their rigid thinking could not make. But secrets cannot stay hidden forever, especially when they begin to show in public behavior. Other nobles noticed that Catharan had changed. He treated his human companion with unusual consideration, sometimes even asking for her opinion in front of others. Whispers spread through the aristocratic networks like poison in water. The ambassador talks to his pet as if it could understand him. They laughed. Perhaps he has spent too long among lesser species and has forgotten his own dignity, The crisis came at the Grand Gala of the Winter Stars, the most prestigious social event of the diplomatic season. Catherine attended with Elena in her formal companion attire. And for a while, everything proceeded according to custom. Then Lord Vethkai, a rival from a conservative faction, decided to make a point. He approached Catherine's table with a smile that held no warmth and turned his attention to Elena with deliberate contempt. Before anyone could react, he grabbed her collar and forced her to her knees. "I hear you have forgotten what a companion is for, Ambassador," Vethkai announced loudly enough for the entire hall to hear. "Allow me to demonstrate. The creature kneels, the creature serves, the creature knows its place." Perhaps you need a reminder of these simple truths. The hall fell silent, and every eye turned to watch. This was entertainment for them, a noble putting an uppity colleague in his place. Catherine was expected to laugh along, to acknowledge that his behavior had been improper and that the lesson was deserved instead. He reached down and helped Elena to her feet. "She's not my companion," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive chamber. "She's my partner and advisor, and she has more wisdom than half this chamber combined. Any insult to her is an insult to me, and I will answer for it accordingly." The silence that followed was absolute. Vethkai's face twisted with rage and disbelief, and the other nobles stared as if Catherine had suddenly grown a second head in that moment. Everything changed, and there was no going back. The political fallout began before they even left the gala. The High Council chamber was the most ancient room in the Volanti Empire, carved from the living rock of their homeworld before humans had learned to make fire. Its walls held 50,000 years of history, and its judgment seat had witnessed the rise and fall of empires beyond counting. Now it would witness something that had never happened before. Catherine stood in the circle of accusation, stripped of his diplomatic robes and dressed in the plain garments of one awaiting judgment. His forearms hung at his sides, and his scales had lost their golden luster from weeks of imprisonment, but his eyes remained steady as he faced the 7 high arbiters, who would decide his fate. "Ambassador," Catherine of the Third House, the chief arbiter intoned, her ancient voice echoing through the chamber, "you stand accused of species contamination, violation of sacred caste protocols, and conduct unbecoming of Volanti nobility. How do you answer these charges?" "I reject them entirely," Catherine replied. "I have violated no law that deserves to exist, and I have contaminated nothing but the prejudices of those who cannot see past their own traditions." A ripple of shock passed through the assembled nobles, who had gathered to witness the trial. Such defiance was unheard of, and many expected the arbiters to end the proceedings immediately with a verdict of death. But the chief arbiter merely raised one hand for silence. "Bring in the evidence," she commanded. The doors opened, and Elena was led into the chamber in chains. Her companion collar had been replaced with heavier restraints, and guards held her arms as if she might somehow break free and attack the assembled might of the Volanti Empire. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if the situation were not so dire. She was forced to kneel in the center of the chamber, her head held down by a guard's hand as the prosecution began its case. "This creature," the prosecutor announced with theatrical disgust, "is the source of the contamination that has infected the ambassador's mind. Observe its primitive form. Only 2 arms, weak muscles, soft skin without any natural protection. Its species has existed for a mere fraction of our history, and yet the accused claims it possesses wisdom equal to our own." He began to list human deficiencies like a merchant, cataloging damaged goods. Their short lifespans that barely exceeded a century, their fragile bodies that could be killed by a fall or fever, their lack of any psionic abilities, their emotional instability that led them to war and destruction. Most damning of all, the prosecutor concluded, this species has no true civilization. They have been spacefaring for less than 2 centuries. And in that time, they have accomplished nothing of note. They are children playing with toys they do not understand. And the ambassador has been foolish enough to mistake their babbling for wisdom. The nobles laughed and nodded in agreement. The case seemed so obvious, so clear-cut, that many wondered why a trial was even necessary. Then the chief arbiter did something unexpected. The accused human will be allowed to speak in its own defense, she announced. This is merely a formality, of course, but tradition demands we hear all voices before judgment. The guards released Elena and stepped back. She rose slowly, rubbing her wrists where the chains had bitten into her skin, and turned to face the assembled might of an empire that had conquered hundreds of worlds. She looked so small, so fragile, so utterly outmatched, and then she began to speak. "You call us primitive," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "You say we have accomplished nothing of note. Allow me to tell you what humanity has done with our brief moment in the universe." She straightened her spine and lifted her head, and something in her bearing changed. This was not a prisoner begging for mercy. This was an ambassador, representing her people before a hostile power, 50,000 years ago. When your ancestors were already building this chamber, mine were huddled in caves, fighting for survival against predators that saw us as food. We had no scales, no claws, no venom, no natural weapons at all. We were soft, weak, and should have been extinct within a generation. She paused and looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of nobles who had never been challenged by a lesser species. But we survived. We learned to make tools from stone, then bronze, then iron, then steel. We tamed fire and used it to reshape our world. We domesticated animals that could have killed us, and we planted crops that turned deserts into gardens. Every generation, we grew stronger, smarter, more capable. Then came the plagues, she continued. Diseases swept across our world and killed millions, sometimes half our entire population in a single outbreak. But we did not accept death as our fate. We studied the sickness, we learned its secrets, and we created vaccines and medicines that turned deadly killers into minor inconveniences. We split the atom, she declared, her voice rising. We discovered the fundamental building blocks of reality and learned to harness their power, yes. We used that power to create weapons of terrible destruction. But we also used it to light our cities and heal our sick and explore the stars. We walked on our moon, she said, and there was pride in her voice now. Less than 70 years after we invented powered flight, we put a human being on another world, not because it was easy, but because it was hard, because the challenge demanded the best we had to give, because reaching beyond our grasp is what humans do. She turned to face the chief arbiter directly. "You have ruled the stars for 50,000 years, Elena said. In that time, has anything changed? Has your art evolved? Has your philosophy grown? Has your society become more kind, more worthy of the power you hold?" The silence in the chamber was absolute. "You call us children," Elena continued. "But children grow. Children learn. Children become more than they were. You look at our brief history and see weakness, but I look at your long history and see stagnation. You have not grown in 50,000 years because you believe you have already reached perfection." She spread her arms wide, encompassing the entire chamber in her gesture. "Humanity has existed for a fraction of your history, and we have never stopped reaching. We have never stopped dreaming. We have never stopped fighting to become something better than we are. You call us primitive, but I call us hungry, and that hunger will carry us to heights you cannot imagine. So yes, execute me if you must," she concluded. "Punish the ambassador for the crime of seeing value in a lesser species. But know this, there are billions more like me on Earth, and millions more scattered across your empire, wearing your collars and learning your secrets. And we will not be content to kneel forever. We are humans, and we do not stay down. Elena stopped speaking and stood perfectly still. Waiting for death or deliverance with equal calm, the chamber erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted accusations and denials, some demanding immediate execution, while others looked troubled by her words. The arbiters conferred in rapid whispers, their ancient faces showing emotions that no one could read. But Catherine watched Elena with something like awe, knowing that whatever happened next, the galaxy would never be quite the same. She had planted a seed in this chamber that would grow no matter how much the old powers tried to cut it down for the first time. The Volanthi had seen humans as something more than pets. They had seen them as a species that refused to stay small. The trial ended not with execution, but with exile, a compromise verdict that satisfied no one and revealed deep fractures within the High Council itself. 3 arbiters had voted for death, 3 for complete acquittal, and the chief arbiter had broken the tie with a sentence that was meant to silence the controversy forever. Catherine was stripped of his title, his lands, his place in Volanthi society. He and his human companion were banished to a remote observation station at the edge of explored space, where they would live out their days in obscurity, forgotten by an empire that wanted to pretend they had never existed, but the empire had made it terrible. Mistake Elena's speech had been recorded by a young aide who believed the galaxy needed to hear what a human truly thought about her captors. Before the trial ended, copies were already spreading through underground networks, servant quarters, trading vessels, remote colonies where companion species gathered in secret to dream of freedom within weeks. The recording had reached every corner of Volanthi space. You call us primitive. Elena's voice echoed in 1,000 hidden rooms. But I call us hungry, and that hunger will carry us to heights you cannot imagine. The words hit like a hammer, cracking the chains that had held human spirits down for years. Companions who had grown used to silence began to whisper, then to speak, then to act. The uprising that followed was unlike any rebellion the galaxy had ever seen. It began not with weapons, but with competence on a mining station in the outer territories. The Volanthi overseers faced a crisis when their primary reactor began to fail. Their own engineers were baffled, their systems giving contradictory readings that no one could interpret. In desperation, they turned to their human maintenance workers, who had long been dismissed as too primitive to understand the technology they helped operate. A woman named Maria Santos studied the reactor for less than an hour before finding the problem. A cascade failure in the cooling system had triggered safety protocols that were themselves malfunctioning, creating a feedback loop that standard Volanthi diagnostics could not detect. She fixed it with a length of cable, a reprogrammed sensor, and a cooling fan salvaged from a broken transport vehicle. How did you know what to do? The chief engineer demanded. Our finest technicians could not solve this problem. Maria smiled, the same smile Elena had worn when she first revealed herself to Catherine. We improvise, she said. It is what humans do. Similar stories began to emerge across the empire. Human companions solving problems that their masters could not. Human workers finding solutions that Volanthi minds had missed. The pattern became impossible to ignore on a diplomatic vessel. A human servant named James Chun brokered a peace agreement between 2 feuding species that had been at war for centuries. He simply listened to both sides, found the common ground they shared, and helped them see each other as something other than enemies, a skill that came naturally to a species whose entire history was defined by conflict and resolution on a medical station. A human companion named Eshel Concour diagnosed a disease that had baffled Volanthi doctors for generations. She recognized the symptoms from a similar illness that had plagued Earth centuries ago and suggested a treatment protocol that saved thousands of lives on a failing colony world. Human farmers taught alien species how to grow food in hostile soil using techniques their ancestors had developed in the deserts and mountains of Earth, techniques born from centuries of learning to survive in environments that should have killed them. Each success story spread through the underground networks, building a picture that could not be denied. Humans were not primitive, they were simply different, shaped by a harsh world and a short history into something that no other species had ever become. Aaron and Elena worked from their exile station, coordinating the movement through coded messages and trusted allies. What had started as survival had become a revolution, but it was a revolution of demonstration rather than destruction. Humans would prove their worth by being undeniably valuable. Violence would only confirm their prejudices. Elena explained during one of their strategy sessions. They expect us to fight like animals, to prove that we are the savages they believe us to be. Instead, we will show them what we really are, and let our actions speak louder than any weapon. The conservative High Lords responded exactly as Elena had predicted. They ordered crackdowns on human gatherings, increased surveillance of companion species, and punished any noble who showed sympathy for the reformist cause. But each act of oppression only strengthened the movement. When human companions were forbidden from speaking in technical meetings, the meetings began to fail without their input. When human workers were restricted to menial tasks, the complex systems they had been maintaining began to break down. When human advisors were removed from diplomatic negotiations, deals collapsed and alliances frayed. The Empire was discovering, slowly and painfully, just how dependent it had become on the species it dismissed as primitive pets. The breaking point came aboard the warship Eternal Dominion, the flagship of the Fourth Fleet. An unexpected enemy attack had crippled the vessel's defensive systems, and standard Volanti protocols were useless against the cascading failures. The ship was going to die, taking 3,000 souls with it. The human companions aboard were technically forbidden from touching military systems. But in the chaos of the emergency, no one stopped them when they began to work. A group of 30 humans, led by a former engineer named David Okafor, jury-rigged a solution using techniques that no Volanti had ever imagined. They bypassed destroyed circuits with manual connections, reprogrammed damaged computers with code they wrote on the fly, and rerouted power through secondary systems that were never designed for such use. The Eternal Dominion survived. Its crew survived. And when the immediate danger had passed, the captain, a noble of the highest caste, approached David Okafor with a question that had been asked by Volanti across the galaxy in recent months. How did you know what to do? David looked at the captain with eyes that held no fear and no submission. We are humans, he said simply. We have been surviving impossible situations since before your ancestors left your homeworld. When everything falls apart, we find a way. When the rules say it cannot be done, we write new rules. When the universe tries to kill us, we refuse to die. He gestured at the damaged ship around them. You built this vessel to be perfect. And when it stopped being perfect, you did not know what to do. We built our entire civilization on imperfection, on failure, on learning from our mistakes and trying again. You call it primitive, but I call it resilient. The captain had no response. He had been raised to believe that humans were lesser beings, useful only for simple tasks and decorative purposes. But he owed his life to beings his culture considered barely sentient. Story of the Eternal Dominion spread faster than any that had come before. For the first time, the upper castes of Volanti society could not dismiss human capabilities as exaggeration or propaganda. Warship crew had witnessed the miracle with their own eyes. The tide was turning, and not even the most conservative lords could pretend otherwise. 5 years had passed since the trial, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible on that day. When Elena Vasquez stood before the High Council and told them what humanity truly was. Now she stood before them again. But everything was different. No chains bound her wrists, no collar circled her neck. And she wore not the garments of a servant, but the formal attire of an ambassador. The chamber was the same ancient room carved from living rock. But its audience had changed. Reformist nobles sat alongside conservatives who had finally accepted that their way was ending. And representatives from a dozen allied species watched from the gallery above. All had come to witness the moment when the Volanti Empire would formally acknowledge what had already become true in practice. Aaron stood beside Elena, restored to his rank and elevated beyond it. The exile had returned not as a prisoner, but as a hero of the reform movement. The noble who had seen the truth before anyone else and had paid the price for speaking it. The chief arbiter, the same ancient being who had presided over the trial, raised her hand for silence. Elena Vasquez of Earth, she announced. You stand before this council not as a companion or a prisoner, but as the official representative of your species. Speak your piece, and know that all the Empire is listening. Elena stepped forward into the circle where she had once knelt in chains. Her voice was calm and strong when she spoke. I come before you today to offer humanity's terms for peace and partnership. She began. These terms are not demands backed by threats of war. We have no fleet to challenge yours, no weapons that could match your power. But we have something that your weapons cannot defeat and your power cannot contain. She paused and looked around the chamber, meeting eyes that had once looked at her with contempt. We have proven ourselves, she continued. Across your empire, in every sector and every industry, humans have demonstrated what we can offer, not as servants or pets, but as partners and equals. Your ships run better with human engineers. Your negotiations succeed with human diplomats. Your colonies thrive with human farmers and builders. These are not claims or boasts. These are facts that every being in this chamber knows to be true. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. Even the conservatives could not deny what the past 5 years had shown. Our terms are simple, Elena declared. First, the immediate and complete abolition of the companion system. Every human in Volanti space is to be freed from their collars today. Not tomorrow, not after further discussion. Second, full diplomatic recognition of Earth and all human colonies as sovereign territory, with protection under Galactic Concord law. Third, a seat for humanity on the Galactic Concord Council, with full voting rights equal to any other member species. The conservatives stirred uneasily, but they did not object. They knew that refusing would only accelerate their own irrelevance in exchange. Elena continued. Humanity offers what we have always offered: partnership. We will share our knowledge, our creativity, our stubborn refusal to accept that any problem is unsolvable. We will work alongside Volanti and every other species that treats us with respect, building a galaxy that is better than what came before. The chief arbiter leaned forward, her ancient eyes studying Elena with an intensity that would have terrified most beings. The prosecution at your trial listed your deficiencies, she said slowly. Your short lives, your weak bodies, your lack of psionic abilities. These facts have not changed. Why should we believe that such a young and fragile species can offer anything of lasting value? Elena smiled, the same smile she had given Ketharan when he first asked her real name. You are right, that we do not live long, she acknowledged. But perhaps that is why we live so intensely. We know that our time is limited, so we fill every moment with purpose. We create art that will outlast our bodies. We build institutions that will outlast our lives. We raise children who will carry our dreams forward after we are gone. You are right that our bodies are fragile, she continued. But fragility has taught us to be clever, to cooperate, to build tools and systems that multiply our strength 1,000-fold. We have walked on our moon and built cities in our deserts and cured diseases that should have ended us, not because we are strong, but because we refuse to accept that weakness was the final word. She turned to address the full chamber. You have ruled this galaxy for 50,000 years, Elena said. And in that time, you have achieved stability, but stability is not the same as progress. You have avoided failure, but you have also avoided growth. You have preserved what is, but you have stopped dreaming of what could be. Humanity is different, she declared. We fail constantly. We fail so often that we have made failure into a tool, a teacher, a stepping stone to something better. Every disaster has taught us. Every setback has strengthened us. Every defeat has made us more determined to win the next battle. She extended her hand toward the chief arbiter in a gesture that was unmistakably human. We are not asking for charity or pity, Elena said. We are offering a partnership that will benefit both our peoples. You have wisdom and power and ancient knowledge. We have creativity and adaptability, an unbreakable will to reach for something more. Together, we can build a galaxy that neither of us could build alone. The chief arbiter studied Elena's outstretched hand for a long moment. In 50,000 years of history, no lesser species had ever made such an offer, and no Volanthi had ever seriously considered accepting one. But these were not ordinary times. And Elena Vasquez was not an ordinary being. The council will vote, the chief arbiter announced. All in favor of accepting humanity's terms? Hands rose across the chamber, reformists and moderates and even some conservatives, who had finally accepted that change was inevitable. When the count was finished, the result was overwhelming. The motion carries, the chief arbiter declared. From this moment forward, the companion system is abolished. Humanity is recognized as a sovereign species with full rights under Galactic Concord law. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. Across the Empire, she knew. The collars were deactivating, the chains were falling. The prisons were opening. Millions of humans were suddenly, officially, irrevocably free. Catharin stepped forward and took her hand, and she saw tears glistening on his golden scales. We did it, he whispered. We actually did it, but the chief arbiter was not finished. She descended from her judgment seat and approached Elena with slow, deliberate steps, and then, to the amazement of everyone present, she bowed. I was wrong about your species, she said quietly. When I presided over your trial, I believed you were merely a curious anomaly, an unusually clever pet who had confused its master. I know better now. She straightened and looked Elena in the eyes. You asked us a question that day, whether anything had changed in 50,000 years. The answer shamans me, because it is no. We have not changed. We have not grown. We have not become more than we were, but watching humanity, I believe we finally can. Elena returned the bow with the respect it deserved. That is all we ever wanted, she replied. Not to replace you, not to defeat you, just to be seen as what we are, and to grow together towards something neither of us can imagine yet. The ceremony continued with formal documents and official proclamations. But the moment that mattered was already past. The galaxy had changed, not through war or conquest, but through the simple, stubborn refusal of a single species to accept that they were less than anyone else. Later that evening, Catharin and Elena stood on a balcony overlooking the ancient city, watching as celebration lights painted the sky in colors that humanity had chosen to represent hope and freedom. They called you a companion, Catharin said softly. Elena took his hand in hers, a gesture that had once been forbidden. Now the most natural thing in the universe. And you called me your equal, she replied. He turned to face her, and his expression held something that looked very much like love. I was wrong, he said. She looked at him sharply, surprised by the words, but he was smiling. human expression that he had learned to make his own over years of growing together. You were always more, he finished. Not because humans are superior, but because you never stopped trying to become what you could be. And that is something no species should ever underestimate. Elena smiled back. And they stood together in silence, watching the stars that now belonged to both their peoples, not through conquest, but through the only victory that truly matters: partnership between equals. Chosen freely, maintained with love, this was what humanity had fought for. What Elena had risked everything to achieve, not power over others, but the right to stand beside them as friends, and as the galaxy began a new chapter in its long history. The species that had once been dismissed as primitive pets took their place among the stars, ready to show the universe what it truly meant to be human.